As you can see from the title of my talk, Yale and the Politics of Slavery, we're going to be talking today about the Yale's place in the story of the coming of the Civil War, which is really my way of sort of framing Yale's place in the long history of the 19th century. But first, before getting too far into the story, I want to just stop for a second and introduce a few people and tell a few stories. So we, as a group working on the 19th century, had one early goal, which was to identify a number of New Haven's prominent African-American abolitionists. And that story very much begins and ends with Amos Beman. Beman's from right here in Connecticut. He was born free. His father fought in the Revolutionary War and gained freedom that way. Beman grew up in Middletown and was actually learned how to read from taking tutoring lessons with a Wesleyan student. But he's best known for being the pastor here at the Temple Street African Congregational Church, which is a post that he held from 1841 to 1856. And that church is now Dixwell Congregational. But aside from being a pastor, Beman was also known as perhaps Yale's leading abolitionist. He was at the forefront of Connecticut's Black suffrage movement. He was a correspondent and a contributor for several African-American anti-slavery newspapers, including The Emancipator, The Colored American. He was also contributed a number of articles to Frederick Douglass's North Star, as well as the second iteration, Frederick Douglass's paper. On top of that, Beman was a regular member of what was known as the Colored Conventions movement, which was an annual meeting of free Black leaders from around the country. And at one point in the 1850s, Beman actually headed up the national conference, which I think strikes at the point about Beman, which is that he's not just a local leader and a local abolitionist, but someone who had a national representation and was someone who was truly a national figure. If you'll notice at the screen here, we have one shot of Beman himself, and the other is actually a selection of several cutouts from Beman's scrapbook, which is housed right here at Beinecke and something that you can check out and view. This particular photo, I think, is him writing back to the Journal and Courier, explaining his visit to one of the conventions. The next person I want to introduce is James C. Pennington. Unlike Beman, Pennington was actually born a slave in Maryland. At some time around age 20, he actually escapes to New York, more specifically the Brooklyn area. When he's there, he finds religion, he learns how to read, he becomes a pastor, and like Beman, he also becomes involved in the Colored Convention movement. And when he's in New York, he also meets and befriends someone named Simeon Jocelyn of New Haven. Jocelyn becomes a friend and a patron of his, and actually pulls several strings and gets Pennington enrolled in the Yale Divinity School. The only issue is that Pennington's never actually admitted to the Divinity School. Because of Connecticut law, he can't actually formally attend or be recognized as a student. He can only technically sit in on classes, what we would now call audit classes. He doesn't have access to the library. He doesn't have other privileges that other students might. And he would only spend, I think, 1 to 2 years at Yale. It's not quite sure. And he would even later look back on his time and describe it not as the time that he was a student at Yale, but he would call it his visitorship, a term he used a little disparagingly. It's after this moment, though, when he comes to Yale, that Pennington perhaps gets most involved in the abolitionist movement. He moves on to pastor a church in Hartford. And while there, he becomes a regular contributor to a number of anti-slavery newspapers, much like Amos Beman. He would also get involved in some Back to Africa movements. And it's here, too, that he would actually write his own fugitive slave narrative, which you can see on the screen. And then, two, he would also write what some people regard as being the first history of African Americans, which is something you can find on Internet Archive, Hathi Trust, and several other places online. And so the point about Pennington, I think, is very much similar to the one about Beman, which is Pennington is not just a local figure here. He's someone that had a national following and a national presence, and was a very prominent abolitionist throughout the country. I also want to take a second and share a few stories about a couple of white abolitionists. One of them is Charles T. Torrey. Torrey was a Yale grad in the 1830s, and like A number of people of his generation, he finds religion during the Great Awakenings of the 1820s and 30s, and he becomes a committed abolitionist. He's first a follower of William Lloyd Garrison, who's perhaps the most prominent abolitionist in the country at the time. But he eventually breaks with Garrison. Garrison was a famous pacifist. He had several, interesting ideas about disunion. Charles Torrey was someone who didn't necessarily believe in those ideas. He believed in much more direct action, and so he and Garrison eventually have a falling out. Torrey establishes a rival organization, and the two eventually split. And sometime after the split, Torrey moves south to the DC and Maryland area, and becomes a noted figure on the Underground Railroad. He becomes one of the most prolific members of or conductors of the Underground Railroad. But he's eventually caught. He's tried, he's imprisoned, and he later actually dies in prison, or he dies in prison. And this is important because Torrey was seen as an early martyr for the movement. Abolitionists decades later would write back in remembrance of Torrey. They would eulogize him. They would talk about his great work. William Still, who was known as the father of the Underground Railroad from Philadelphia, he would write back and include Torrey's story in the opening chapters of his great history of the Underground Railroad. He would write about Torrey as an inspiration. John Brown was also someone who would later say that Charles Torrey was an early inspiration from him. And so the point again is that Torrey, someone who was a Yale grad, was very much a martyr for the abolitionist movement in his memory. Oops. The next person I want to introduce is Reuben Crandall. And I should say from the beginning that the person who's depicted there is not Reuben Crandall. I'll explain that in a second. I should also maybe say that Reuben Crandall is someone who is in some ways overshadowed by his sister, Prudence Crandall, who in the in the 1830s, she taught a school for girls in the Hartford area. She opens this school up to young girls of color. And because of that, it gets run out of the state. It becomes a sort of a national sensation. And so Reuben is in fact her sister. Reuben is her brother. But much like his sister, Reuben is someone of strong anti-slavery credentials. He attends Yale, though there's no evidence that he actually graduated from Yale. And sometime in the 1830s, he becomes a botanist and later moves to DC. And he sets up his shop in the Georgetown area of DC. And one day, early on in his time there, the police actually break into his botany shop. And when they go in there, they discover several anti-slavery pamphlets that they argue Crandall intended to distribute. And so Crandall is arrested, he's tried, and the person who elects to prosecute him is actually Francis Scott Key, who's depicted there. Key, aside from being an amateur poet, happened to be the district attorney of Washington, D.C. at the time. And Key was someone who saw himself as an anti-slavery reformer. He was an active member of the American Colonization Society. He had spoken before about how slavery was a great moral and political wrong. But nonetheless, Key was also one of the great anti-abolitionists of all times. He hated the abolitionists, and he tried to prove a point and make an example out of the anti-slavery movement by prosecuting Crandall. Key doesn't actually have a case. He can never actually prove that Crandall intended to distribute the pamphlets in order to solicit a slave uprising. And so he loses the case, he loses the jury, but it does Reuben Crandall very little good because he catches tuberculosis in prison and dies only a few months later. And so very much like Charles Torrey, Reuben Crandall is seen as a martyr to the movement. Abolitionists decades later write about him, they eulogize him, and they very much remember his memory. But the one thing I'd want to say about some of these folks is that their abolitionism isn't necessarily tied to Yale. They are exceptions rather than the rule. And in some respects, when we talk about abolitionism at Yale in any formal sense, we're speaking of an oxymoron. It didn't really exist. And we know that to be true in part because of Andrew Dickson White. Andrew Dickson White was the university president of Cornell. I think he had also served in the same post at Cal Berkeley. He was a prominent university figure in the latter half of the 19th century. And he happened to be a student here at Yale in the 1840s. And he tells us that, in fact, the overall operating norm at Yale was to do anything to sort of preserve the Union, even if it meant compromising with whatever pro-slavery sympathies were on campus. White, though, did mention two really important exceptions. The first of which was Theodore Dwight Woolsey, who, for some of you that know campus really well, this is him, emboldened here in bronze. Woolsey was the president of Yale from 1846 to 1871, which meant that he was the president here throughout the Civil War crisis. Our colleague Judy Schiff describes him as someone who oversaw the most dramatic transformation in Yale's history. He's someone who saw Yale become sort of a more parochial religious institution to really a modern university. And from all that we can gather, Woolsey seems to be someone that was against slavery most all of his life. He was anti-slavery to some degree for as long as we can tell. Though he was never all that active in anti-slavery abolitionist organizations. He was somewhat moderated in his abolitionism, though that would change in the 1850s. In the 1850s, he would start a newspaper known as the New Englander, and in the newspaper, he would write several essays where he begins to attack slavery and speak out more openly against it. He would also start what is a really interesting correspondence with someone named Francis Lieber. Lieber, some of you may know, is famous for his Lieber Code, which was sort of a 19th century sort of ethic of warfare. Lieber was perhaps the most prominent political theorist of his time. At the moment, or in the 1850s, he taught at what was then South Carolina College, what is now the University of South Carolina. And in several stunning book reviews, and then later several essays that become a lengthy correspondence, Theodore Dwight Woolsey sort of reproaches Lieber for his position on slavery. The two talk, they share their correspondence, and Woolsey eventually gets Lieber to see slavery a bit differently. And so within that correspondence, we can begin to see Woolsey move much more actively against slavery than he had previously. Another exception is Leonard Bacon. Bacon was a Yale graduate. He then became pastor here at First Congregational Church in New Haven. And he and Woolsey are friends, are lifetime friends. They also share a pretty similar trajectory. In the 1830s, or 1820s and 30s, they organize an African Improvement Society. They both dabble in the American Colonization Society. They also, kind of interestingly enough, set up their own New Haven Anti-Slavery Society or Anti-Slavery Association that includes Woolsey, Bacon, one other member. It doesn't last very long. It gets disbanded. It exists kind of in name only, but nonetheless, they do that in the 1830s. But much like Woolsey, Bacon would evolve on the issue, where his abolitionism was moderated early on in his life. He would eventually evolve and become a much more outspoken abolitionist. And one of the real moments that crystallizes that is in 1849. He publishes, or excuse me, in 1846, he publishes the document you see on the screen there, Slavery and Occasional Essays. And the reason I point this out is because this was a document or a book or collection of pamphlets that was said to have a real impact on Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, I think much of what Lincoln is saying in the Lincoln-Douglas debates comes right out of Bacon's Slavery and Occasional Essays. But if both Bacon and Woolsey are somewhat moderate in their abolitionism throughout the 1830s and 40s, they both have a bit of a road to Damascus moment in 1854 with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska bill. And I should stop and say that this tracks pretty well with what we've learned throughout the project about New Haven in general. It seems that both in New Haven as well as on the wider Yale campus, that this is the real moment where everything begins to turn. Which is somewhat odd that a bill that would create two territories, Kansas and Nebraska, would have this type of impact. But it does, and it matters because it basically ends the idea of compromise. The Kansas-Nebraska Act basically says that the people of both territories will get to decide whether they want to be slave or free when the different territories become states. And this matters, again, because it ends the idea of compromise. It effectively nullifies the Missouri Compromise, which had been on the books since 1820. You can, in fact, see on the map there, you can see the Missouri Compromise line of 1820. And what that compromise did was it outlawed slavery north of that line, basically the bottom boundary of Missouri. So this nullifies the Missouri Compromise, but it also reopens the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 didn't necessarily settle the question of slavery in the West, but it had tabled it, and it basically sort of kicked the can down the road. But what the Kansas-Nebraska Act does, it reopens those debates, and it proves to Northerners like Woolsey and like Bacon that compromise is something that just can't be had. It also looks a lot to them like it's the South who are trying to actively press slavery on the rest of the country, and the South won't actually ever be appeased. And so the Kansas-Nebraska Act becomes a real rallying cry and a real moment, a real turning point for Woolsey, for Bacon, and several other New Haven and Yale associated abolitionists. Ooh. Sorry, I apologize for that. Woolsey himself would take a pretty active role speaking out against slavery after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. One of the things that he does is he signs on to a document known as the Nebraska Remonstrance, which is something he signs along with several other prominent university officials, some being affiliated with Harvard, that speaks out on the Kansas-Nebraska Act and denounces it. He would also sign on to a document known as the Connecticut Memorial, which does something similar, and it begs the president to not sign it. He also takes part in a meeting that's reflected here on the screen. The images here are a little bit close together. It's a little bit fuzzy, you can't see it very well. But what this is a newspaper cutout describing a Bible and Rifles for Kansas meeting here in New Haven at North Church. And so what it is this church that's full of angry anti-slavery people. Henry Ward Beecher's here, Benjamin Silliman's here, and what happens is they end up raising money for Bibles and for rifles to go to Kansas to fight in the conflict that becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. And again, Theodore Woolsey is here, and he's in the audience, and he's there with quite a few Yale officials. And so in Woolsey taking such an active and outspoken stance against slavery, it elicits a pretty sharp Southern response. In return, Southerners, Southern parents, Southern leaders, they begin threatening to withhold their patronage if Yale doesn't, if someone like Woolsey doesn't stay quiet. And what this means is they would no longer send their sons to school in the North, to Yale. And you can see that reflected here in the image that's on the left. But I would say too that this is something that actually exacerbates a larger trend. Already starting as early as 1851, you see Southerners who are constantly on guard about what they see as creeping abolitionism at Yale. We know from 1851, there's a moment in which William Seward is invited to come give a commencement address, and Southern students, Southern officials, as well as Southern sympathizing Northerners step in and get him removed as the commencement speaker. And this comes to a head in 1857 when the university actually invites Charles Sumner to come give the commencement speech. But he can't because he's still dealing with his wounds from being beaten on the floor of Congress. And so Wendell Phillips, the famous abolitionist, comes and gives his speech in his stead, which angers Southerners. And so again, this kind of tracks on what we have detected as a wider trend. And we can't confirm this, but evidence suggests that in fact, Southern students arrival at Yale begins to trickle down and decrease over the course of the 1850s. And so we do also know exactly where this leads, which is eventually to Fort Sumter into the Civil War. And so that was concludes my quick, short, brief talk, and now I'm happy to answer questions.